This past week, Arizona Senator and former Republican presidential nominee John McCain went ballistic on the Senate floor, ranting about how Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is a Russian agent doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin. Now, some of you have probably seen the clip, but may not really understand it in its proper context. The reason that John McCain blew up on Rand Paul might surprise you. You see, McCain is trying to help billionaire globalist George Soros with one of his many schemes that he's carrying out on behalf of the Rothschilds. Senator Paul, on the other hand, is trying to stop Soros. George Soros, in case you're not aware, is an agent of Evelyn de Rothschild, who is the head of the black nobility and the leader of the Illuminati. McCain is working for Soros while Paul is opposing Soros. It's really a fascinating story. I'm going to play the video clip and share with you some insider information that you will not hear anywhere else, so stay tuned. I'll start by showing you the video clip of McCain's meltdown, and then we'll talk about it for a while.
So, Mr. President, if there is objection, and I note the senator from Kentucky on the floor, I will say before I read this, if there is objection, you are achieving the objectives of Vladimir Putin. You're achieving the objectives of trying to dismember this small country that has already been the subject of attempted coup. I have no idea why anyone would object to this, except that I will say, if they object, they are now carrying out the desires and ambitions of Vladimir Putin, and I do not say that lightly.
Mr. President? Senator from Kentucky.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I note the senator from Kentucky leaving the floor without justification or any rationale for the action that he has just taken. That is really remarkable. That a senator blocking a treaty that is supported by the overwhelming number, perhaps 98 at least, of his colleagues, would come to the floor and object and walk away. And walk away. The only conclusion you can draw when he walks away is he has no argument to be made. He has no justification for his objection to having a small nation be part of NATO that is under assault from the Russians. So I repeat again, the senator from Kentucky is now working for Vladimir Putin. I yield the floor.
The number one practical enemy of George Soros and the New World Order today is Russian President Vladimir Putin. Hands down, he is doing more to oppose the New World Order than any other global leader at the moment. That has attracted the crosshairs of the New World Order's hitman, George Soros. Soros has already established a major influence, if not complete control, over several Central and European nations, including Kosovo, Macedonia, Georgia, Romania, Albania, and Moldova. We know that Soros was behind the 2014 overthrow of the pro-Russian government of Ukraine. When the ethnic Russians of eastern Ukraine and Crimea turned to Mother Russia for support, the U.S. State Department responded by coordinating a massive set of economic sanctions against Russia, sanctions that were designed to cripple the nation economically and bring Putin to his knees. Soros pressed hard for the United States to pass these sanctions using his political puppets, including Arizona Senator John McCain. The area that Russia was hardest hit from these sanctions was in its oil and gas industry. Half of Russia's gross domestic product and 70% of its exports comes from oil and gas sales, much of it to Western Europe. So, if you can cut off Russia's ability to sell oil and gas, the nation could possibly well, quite likely, suffer an economic collapse. And that's exactly what the USA has been trying to do through its sanctions on Russia for the last 2.5 years. Obama rallied his Western European allies together to try to destroy Russia's economy. This is simply a matter of economic warfare. However, it hasn't been enough. Somehow, Vladimir Putin has been able to hold on. And one of the ways that he's done this is by working on new oil pipelines to make it cheaper and easier to get their Russian product into the markets other than just Western Europe. For example, one major project has been Russia's joint efforts with Turkey, and it's called the Turkish Stream or Turk Stream. This pipeline lets Russia get their gas down to Turkey, to Greece, to Macedonia, to Serbia and Hungary and that region. And this is helping to keep Russia's economy from collapsing. But being the economic hitman that he is, George Soros concocted a scheme to further damage Russia's oil and gas revenues. Because Russia is trying to sell to nations like Macedonia and Serbia, for example, Soros and his handler Nathaniel Rothschild have virtually purchased the entire nation of Montenegro. Nathaniel Rothschild, who, by the way, is just 2 years older than me, he is the son of Jacob Rothschild. Nathaniel is the co-chairman of Atticus Capital, an international investment firm. He's the director of his father's RIT Capital Partners. He's also the director of the Rothschild Foundation. If you guys want to know who the up-and-coming head of the Rothschild dynasty is going to be when his father dies, Nathaniel is the man to watch. So, this team-up between the ultra-rich and powerful elites, Soros and Rothschild, gave these men virtual control over the politicians in Montenegro. Using these political puppets in Montenegro, Soros worked out sweet deals for oil and gas exploration companies to come in and start drilling in the pristine, untapped waters of the Adriatic Sea, which is off the coast of Montenegro. And of course, it just so happens that Soros himself has massive financial investments in these same oil and gas companies. Now, maybe you've already guessed it, but what Soros is doing is drilling for oil and gas to supply to the neighboring countries that Vladimir Putin has been trying to tap into in order to keep Russia's economy afloat. Soros is trying to undercut Russia in the oil business in that region. Of course, Soros is going to make hundreds of millions of dollars in profits personally, but this also deals a huge blow to Russia and puts them back on track toward potential economic collapse. What may surprise some of you is that a key figure in this plot, parts of which have been in operation for years, is our good friend, Senator John McCain. I had to do some real digging to find some of this stuff, but I've got some very juicy material for you. Finding this kind of material is what makes investigative reporting so much fun for me. Okay, you may remember that back in 2008, the globalists thwarted the will of the Republican voters and they granted the party's presidential nomination to a man that all of us hated, Senator John McCain. Let's be honest, as Republicans, none of us wanted McCain as the nominee, but he is who we were given. Well, McCain was busy at work during that time, but not work for the American people. McCain was working for Russian oligarchs. In this article from October of 2008, here's what the authors write. Quote, in his acceptance speech at the Republican convention, John McCain lashed out at Putin and the Russian oligarchs who, and now they're quoting McCain, quote, rich with oil wealth and corrupt with power, are reassembling the old Russian Empire. The article continues, yet despite McCain's tough talk, behind the scenes his top advisors have cultivated deep ties with Russia's oligarchy indeed. They have promoted the Kremlin's geopolitical and economic interests as well as some of its most unsavory business figures through greedy cynicism and geopolitical stupor. The most notable example is the tale of how McCain and his campaign manager Rick Davis advanced what became a key victory for the Kremlin, gaining control over the small but strategically important country of Montenegro. All right, the article goes on to describe what I've been able to confirm through some other sources as well. At the time, Vladimir Putin was trying to get a Russian outpost set up somewhere along the Adriatic coastline, and Montenegro seemed like it was his best option. Montenegro, of course, at that time was still part of Serbia, but John McCain came along. He used all of his political influence and his connections to help make that happen. Now, doesn't that sound strange? John McCain trying to help Putin and the Russians? I found that as I read a lot of these old articles, there was a common thread. The authors of the articles knew that their facts were right, but they were confused. John McCain seemed to be working for Putin and Russia by helping them to get Montenegro to break away and become independent from Serbia, so that it would be easier to take control of. But that didn't make sense to the authors. Well, that's because there is more to the story. Remember, we've got to look at more than just one or two pieces of a puzzle to know what the finished puzzle is going to look like. I've put the pieces together so that I can tell you all the rest of the story, or at least a much larger part of it. Yes, McCain did seem to be working to help Russia gain control of Montenegro. But what Putin didn't realize yet was that McCain's loyalties were not to Putin, they were not to Russia in general. They were loyalties to a particular Russian oligarch, a man named Oleg Deripaska. Oleg Deripaska was known by the nickname Putin's oligarch. He was the 9th richest billionaire in the world at the time, super rich man. He owned the world's largest yacht, which was called the Queen K. It was so huge it had a crew of more than 70 people. Oleg was the controlling shareholder of a company called Rothschild. This is the Russian aluminum giant, which happens to be the biggest aluminum company in the entire world. It just so happened that 40% of Montenegro's GDP and 80% of its annual export earnings came from the sale of aluminum. So Oleg went into Montenegro and bought up all of the aluminum plants, meaning that overnight, Putin's pal, Oleg Deripaska, had taken control of the national economy of Montenegro. Now, in the shadows, John McCain was working with Oleg Deripaska. I dug up some photos here to show you from 2006. These photos were taken in Montenegro. This particular yacht was owned by an Italian felon, a man named Raffaello Folieri. He was a rich and powerful player, also a convicted con man. You may notice standing behind him was his girlfriend, someone you might recognize, actress Anne Hathaway. The man whose hand he's shaking is Rick Davis. Davis was John McCain's presidential campaign manager, but Davis was also a lobbying firm president. It was called Davis Manafort. Powerful lobbying firm. It was this lobbying firm that ran the entire campaign for independence for Montenegro to break away from Serbia in 2006. All right, so John McCain's campaign manager was a big-time lobbyist who was getting funding from Russian businessmen to help Montenegro break away so that Montenegro could be taken over. Now, you'll notice in this picture, walking behind Rick Davis, is Senator McCain. McCain and Davis went out on the yacht with Folieri and Anne Hathaway. And that was kind of the cover story. The cover story was that it was just a special occasion to celebrate John McCain's 70th birthday. But that's not true. You see, anchored not that far away was the mega yacht of Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Remember the Queen K yacht. What happened was that McCain boarded one yacht and they snuck over to link up with Deripaska on the Queen K. You see, McCain wasn't actually working to help Vladimir Putin or Russia. He was trying to use Deripaska's wealth and close connections to the Russian government to gain control over Montenegro to turn over to Russia's enemies, to these New World Order globalists, including George Soros and Rothschild. And that is how things eventually played out. If you do some searching, you guys will find out that Vladimir Putin absolutely hates John McCain. That's because McCain is a tool of the globalists who are trying to destroy Russia. Well, the relationship between Putin and Deripaska became bitter. And that bad blood was put on display in 2009 when the worlds of Vladimir Putin and Oleg Deripaska collided in this little town called Pikoyovo in Russia. What happened was that Deripaska owned a huge brick factory in this town. He also owned the town's electric company. And he was making a killing off the utilities business, but the locals couldn't afford the rates. So what Deripaska's electric company did was it started shutting off the electricity to the people's homes. And if you know what a Russian winter is like, it's not a pleasant thing to go without heat. So this really angered the residents. It angered them so much that they went out into the streets to protest. And joining them in this protest were all of the workers from Deripaska's brick factory. They walked off the job. In response, Deripaska's factory managers fired all of the workers, making things even worse. So, the people decided to go out and protest on a highway, the major highway. They shut it down by causing a traffic jam that was so huge it extended 400 kilometers all the way to St. Petersburg, and that got the attention of Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. Putin decided to take matters into his own hands. He went to Pikoyovo and summoned together all of the factory workers. He got some of the residents together. He ordered Deripaska himself to appear in this meeting. Putin invited television crews to come in to broadcast this meeting on the news throughout Russia. And in front of the entire country, he verbally whipped the factory owners. He whipped the local politicians. He said, "You have made thousands of people hostage to your ambitions, to your unprofessionalism, and simply to your greed." And then, because the factory owners kept saying that they couldn't figure out how to resolve the impasse, Vladimir Putin told the factory owners that he had already brought documentation for them to sign. It was a pledge for the factory managers to rehire all of the laid-off workers and to pay them the missing wages from the time that they had been out of work. And right there on TV, Vladimir Putin sent this paperwork around and had all of the owners and managers sign the documents. Then, when he got the paper back, he asked if everybody had signed the agreement. He looked over the sheet and he saw that Deripaska, the billionaire, had not yet signed it. So in front of everyone and on television, Putin ordered Deripaska to get up, walk around, and sign the document in front of everybody. After Deripaska signed it, Putin noticed that he was walking away with his pen and he spat at him to give his pen back. It was very humiliating for Deripaska. I would love to show you this video clip, but I can't because of copyright protections. But just go to the YouTube search box, put in Putin Deripaska, that's Deripaska, and several videos should come up. Now, let's just review this really quick. Between John McCain's two presidential runs, 2000 to 2008, McCain was secretly working with corrupt Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. He was also working with a powerful American lobbyist, Rick Davis, to help Montenegro declare independence from Serbia. This oligarch then took control of Montenegro by buying up the industries that control the national economy. And Deripaska's most notable business partner in the process was Nathaniel Rothschild. Rothschild, later on, then partnered with George Soros. And rather than using Montenegro to help Russia, these men turned around and exploited Montenegro by taking control of their oil and gas resources to try to destroy Russia through competition. And by the way, if it matters to you, Deripaska, Rothschild, and Soros are all Khazarian Jews. Now let's skip forward to today. McCain has been pushing to get Montenegro admitted into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was basically a military pact that the United States set up after World War II to keep Soviet communism from spreading to surrounding nations. The basic deal with NATO is that if the Soviets ever attacked one of the NATO members, then all of the NATO members would band together to fight to repel the Soviets. But the Soviet Union collapsed almost 30 years ago, so NATO should have been disbanded because it's no longer used for that purpose. But instead, the United States has dramatically expanded NATO's membership to include all kinds of little countries around Russia, so that today, if Russia gets into a squabble with any one of its neighbors, the United States will initiate World War III to defend that little NATO member. In truth, more than 70% of the military troops that belong to NATO are actually United States military officers and soldiers. Then you've got about 15% that belong to the British, and the remaining 15% is made up of soldiers from the other 26 NATO member nations. So in reality, NATO is just a cover for the United States military to operate around the world under a different name, so that the American people don't get upset at all of the things they're getting involved in. I personally hate NATO as an organization, but John McCain loves it. NATO functions as a massive military force to do the dirty work of the Rothschilds and their agents, including George Soros. The Rothschilds want Montenegro. They want it included as a NATO member so that they can prevent Russia from being able to regain controlling influence over Montenegro's resources. And McCain is the puppet that has led the charge to admit Montenegro into NATO. Montenegro has already been approved for membership in NATO. That's already done. But before membership is possible, there has to be the signing of a treaty. And this treaty with Montenegro in the United States first goes to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. If that committee unanimously approves the treaty with Montenegro, then Montenegro then ascends to become a member of NATO. But that's not what happened. One man, and only one man, on the Foreign Relations Committee stood up to the Rothschild-Soros plot and said no. And that man was Senator Rand Paul. And because Senator Paul successfully blocked the treaty, he effectively stopped the globalists from being able to add Montenegro to NATO membership. I cannot say how proud I am of Senator Paul. He is literally risking his life to take a stand against the Rothschild network. And that's why McCain, who has been working for the Rothschilds for years now, was so angry at Senator Paul. The fight isn't over, though. It's still, unfortunately, likely that Montenegro is going to be added to NATO. Because what can happen at this point is, if the treaty is taken to the full U.S. Senate, if 2/3 of the senators vote in favor of the treaty, then it will pass and Montenegro joins NATO. I don't think that Rand Paul has enough allies in the Senate who are not already owned or heavily influenced by Soros and the Rothschilds. I don't think he has enough allies to defeat the vote, but we'll see. Well, folks, does that help shed some light on things for you? Can you see why John McCain was so mad and why he was accusing Senator Rand Paul of working for Vladimir Putin? It's a dirty, dirty game that the New World Order is playing. These are greedy, bloodthirsty demons, men who will stop at nothing to get what they want. And considering that their ultimate goal is control of the entire world, this is a battle worth fighting. Let's not leave Senator Paul alone in this fight. I want you guys to take a minute when this video is over to contact your senators and tell them to vote no on admitting Montenegro to NATO. You can write your own letter, or you can just copy and paste the little thing that I'm putting down in the video description. Just take it and copy it right on over. Won't take but a second. I've also put a link down there to a directory that will connect you to your senators. Make sure you write to both your senators, because you got 2 of them. Well, that's going to be it for this episode, folks. Take a stand, take charge, and do your best to stand up for what is right. For the End Times News Report, I'm Jake Morphonios.